Hello, I'm Taeha, and today I'm here with Mr. Matthew Encina in his studio, the Mod Musing Studio, and thank you for allowing me to film here once again.
For
We
sure.
filmed here many times, but it's always a beautiful space to be in.
Thank you.
And you're launching the Encore Series 2 on the
Yes.
21st of this month. The product should already be live by the time this video goes out. So instead of reviewing the keyboard, there's already been tons of reviews on this, and it's clearly been popular to receive an Encore. I decided to ask Matthew some questions regarding the design process and some of the manufacturing processes that he went through with Mode to kind of give you guys a different perspective on the product. So without further ado, in the video that you put out with the first initial launch of this, the how I turned my keyboard into a product, something like that.
Yeah, how I turned my idea into a product. Yeah.
You briefly mentioned that the G80 was a big inspiration for this keyboard. And at least among the keyboard enthusiasts, it's a very well-loved keyboard, but I wanted to hear from a prolific designer such as yourself, what it is you think about that aesthetic that a lot of people really enjoy.
Obviously, the number one feature from the Cherry G80 series is the cherry bezel, right? The cherry lip, as we've come to know. So that big bezel in the front. It's such a unique feature that just lowers the overall front height of it. It just creates such a distinct look that so many keyboards, including my own, have tried to replicate and emulate in their own design. So I think that's a big one. I think the other thing, obviously, compared to a lot of modern boards now, like we see here with the Sonnet, a lot of modern boards use much thinner bezels, right? And I think a lot of the language has moved that direction. And one thing that I've always liked with a lot of retro boards is the much chunkier bezels, right? So some of that is something that I wanted to bring in. So I think those are particular features about the G80 that I think a lot of designers like, but really it's that cherry lip that everyone's tried to replicate.
So at least in keyboards, like thicker bezels generally kind of evoke a retro feel. Would you say that's true in general in your experience from like overall product design, or would you say that's like specific to keyboards?
That's a great question. I think in keyboards specifically, whenever somebody sees a chunkier bezeled board, usually, especially if it's an outsider, their reaction usually is, oh, that looks so retro, right? So even common people have that sense of how those two things relate. I would say that probably a lot of older designs, retro designs, definitely feel a little bit chunkier.
Right, or like they have big foreheads.
Right. And then, I mean, over time, again, things just get slimmer, a lot more sleek. Even if you look at a lot of personal electronics over the last 30 years, they did start larger out of necessity, and then they just shrank because technology allowed that, right? So I think those two things kind of go hand in hand, and what people consider to be modern are some of those features of things shrinking down. But because a lot of product design these days, you can do anything. Like you can have small internals and have a bigger body, a bigger case for the sake of doing that. And I think now you have the kind of luxury to play on that if you like. And that's something that I definitely introduced on the Encore, where even though I like a lot of boards that have much thinner bezels, for me, I'm always attracted to things like the large forehead on the Mode 80, for instance, right? Which I know is very polarizing for a lot of folks. There's still a lot of keyboards out there with like big foreheads or big bezels. So for me, my kind of challenge was trying to balance that out where it still feels modern, but have enough surface where we could really celebrate the materials here, in this case, the wood. I like wood as a material. Obviously, if you look around my studio, I have so much wood, like there's white oak everywhere. I've built a lot of this stuff by hand. So it's that amateur woodworker in me that's coming through, and just the love for, these materials here. So once we began the design process, these are some of the kind of like steps in the process. So we'll start with these aluminum chunks right here. So these guys are extruded aluminum. So the first part of the process is just getting your raw material close to the size that you're going to be working with. So the way that an extrusion works is you have a profile, which is that shape right there, and you just get a piece of material and you push it through there. So here we're getting chunks of metal pushed out to the profile of, that's the bottom, and then this is the top. So we get close to the initial shape. Then the next part is taking those things, and this is two separate pieces that are screwed together, and taking this into the CNC. So right here, this is before it is sandblasted, or bead blasted rather. So you can see all the machining marks, right? So it takes a CNC to go through all of this and cut out all the details. So you'll use different bits for each part of the process, and then it usually gets turned over and you do the other side, right? Depending if there's details on the other side. And you just keep going through that process. And obviously the more complex, the more machine time, the more expensive it gets, right? Because that's just the longer it sits in the machine, the more people have to touch it and move it around between the different steps of the process. So yeah, this gets CNC'd and eventually gets blasted so that it can be anodized or coated to get to the color that we want. But in a similar fashion, the wood, these are just much smaller samples, but kind of similar to the thickness that we would eventually get there. This is white oak untreated. So this is a raw sample from our supplier. And then this is a raw walnut. So these were the two first colors that we did with Encore Series 1. And, we get a whole piece of wood. Same thing, it gets cut out in the CNC.
To me, it feels like every keyboard project you've taken on has had some kind of creative constraint that you had to work within. The X-ray keycaps, for example, because you were trying to go for that translucent look. I know you mentioned some of the issues with the double shotting sprues being visible, so you kind of had to figure that out. With the Encore, you decided to work with wood, for example, which has their own manufacturing constraints. Do you enjoy working within, or like placing these constraints for yourselves? And is that by choice, or just happens to be like certain materials that you like have all these constraints that come along with it?
Yeah, I think that's a two-part question. The first part is usually most projects, whatever material you choose to work in or what output you choose to work in, there's always going to be some level of constraint, whether that's a little or a lot. As a creative, constraints is what makes you creative, right? Because if it could be anything without any constraints, it's actually a lot more overwhelming because there are no rules in place.
Right.
You can do anything, so the possibilities are endless, right? Versus if you have a very clear design goal and set of constraints, it's actually much easier to design within a specific sandbox. With these, it's like, okay, I have wood, I want to feature it somehow. Wood is tricky to work with because it can warp in particular climates, moistures, and it has to somehow seamlessly blend in with its metal counterparts, which aren't susceptible to that. So designing within that constraint was a pretty fun thing to think about. And it's a good challenge because when you're able to resolve or overcome or work around those constraints, to me, like that always brings a level of joy. It's hard, right? And hard things, I think, are worth doing because it makes the product a little bit more special in the end. You can kind of see how in this area where the mounting blocks go, this protrudes out into this. So you can kind of see it right there. You see how there's that block that protrudes into the wood? Yeah. So we intentionally created all of these right angles to reinforce the wood from wobbling around. So with wood, because it's an organic material, when it's exposed to different climates, it shrinks and expands. Right. But if you have these hard alu walls, it's not really going to shift. So we designed that intentionally so we won't have all of a sudden boards where the tops is slid over 2 millimeters, right? Like that's definitely by design to hold that in place. And then in here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fasteners that also just hold those corners into place. Yeah.
One thing that I really appreciated about the mode is that, like, no matter what angle you look at the Encore, from, it almost feels like it highlights a different aspect or element of the board that's not repeating itself from another angle or feeling too forced. So like from the top view, clearly the wood is kind of the accent. From like the side, you're kind of celebrating the 3 different material choices that you have. The bottom has that really distinct curve, inset curve. Was that kind of like by choice, or did it just kind of happen?
Actually, I didn't think about that particular constraint in mind. Like I wanted all angles to look good, right? I think anyone would want that, right? But the way I designed this was kind of in sequence. So I started with the thing you see the most, which is the face, so the top, right? So I already knew that I wanted this interesting split. Like that was one of the first design features that I put in there. And so once you have the top, it's like, all right, well, the side looks terrible. How do I make the side look good? And how do these two things work together, right? So thinking one plane at a time. Then I got to the bottom eventually, and then I got to the back. So I actually worked in that sequence, trying to make sure that the most prominent thing gets the most attention, and I design around that, and then make little adjustments to each side as they kind of shape based around the first face. So this is the back here, as we can see. We get this nice little curve. This is the first prototype. So the transition on this curve, one of the things we wanted to do is just smooth that out. So when we went from the first prototype to the second one, we worked on just smoothing this out a little bit more. But you know, this was very close. This was like 95% there with just very few notes to address when we got the first proto, because again, working with Mode, they know their manufacturer, they know the processes. It helped eliminate a lot of time where we can do things digitally without having to do many extensive runs of prototypes.
So at one point in the video, how you turned your idea into a keyboard, you mentioned that you ran into a manufacturing constraint with the bottom being too complex. So you had initially simplified it, but then it became too boring, at least your initial version of it. And this is kind of somewhat of a contentious topic on my channel, at least, how on a keyboard, at least, we have the most real estate for design, creativity on the bottom, but at the same time, it's on the bottom right. And if it's on the bottom and you have this crazy design, but you're always typing on a keyboard, does it really matter how nice and elegant your bottom is? Like, how did you strike the balance between adding elements of design on the bottom, but no one's gonna see it?
Yeah, so the bottom for me, it's like somebody's gonna see it, right? It's not like an element that's completely hidden, right? So you're right, there's so much real estate there, you'll probably only see it if you flip it. But it's still there, right? And because I know it's there, it has to look good. With a lot of keyboards, you know, I like a lot of simple design, like things that aren't too overly decorative, right? Without a particular reason why, right? So there's a lot of boards that, you know, are interesting to have interesting concepts or inspirations, and sometimes it's a little heavy-handed for my taste. I like keyboards that are inspired by certain things, but then do it tastefully with a lot of restraint. So for me, like the easiest thing was like, oh, it could have just been a box bottom. And it would have been fine. It would have been okay. It will serve its purpose. No one's gonna see it. But it was still an interesting challenge. It's like, okay, it's there. Can I strike that balance of something that is still pretty simple and minimal, but has just enough of design element that relates to the board? So actually, I tried a lot of different designs for the bottom. So like fluted designs with, you know, different rib designs, more decorative stuff. I just kind of tried everything. And I ended up coming up with a design that very much relates to the other aspects of the board, right? So if you look at the bottom there in the front, you know, there's like a really big curve, and then it goes to straight lines. Well, actually, all that is just a reflection of this. It's an exaggeration of this. So if you look at the front of the board, we have these curves right here, and everywhere else is boxy. So I just took that kind of concept, that design motif, and replicated it on the bottom and just exaggerated it so that those two things have a relationship. And then in terms of all of the curves, all of the fillets on here, all of these are all related in terms of how much, like what number of fillet or curving goes on each part. They're all usually multiples of 3. I just think about design language, right? So whenever you're designing something, if you develop a key motif for it, so again, this split contrasting materials, like if that is the design language, then you think about that throughout. So every other aspect, every other detail is like this thing that you're talking about right here, straight lines versus curved lines, like that's similar to the contrast of these two materials. So I think of extreme contrast like that, soft and then sharp. And then that's why this appears the way that it is. And that's why, these curves are related to these curves. So I just think about relationships between stuff. The things that, in my opinion, where design breaks is if you do an element here and then a different element here and then a different element here, and they have no relationship to each other. There's no kind of reason, cohesion of the language that makes sense, right? Like you're trying to do too much. And I definitely ran into that during the process of designing this, where the bottom didn't feel like it related to the top. It's like, wow, that's a cool bottom in some of my designs, but it doesn't relate to the rest of the language. So I had to use my restraint and pull back. It's like, why did I do this? And if I have a good answer as to why, then it has a good reason for being there.
So this is another contentious topic in the hobby. Some people say that a great keyboard should not need foam. Do you, as a industrial/product designer, agree with that sentiment after having been in this hobby for a while?
I think there's a time and a place for everything. It's interesting. The longer you're in a hobby or have a particular interest, the more refined your tastes become, right? Like the more you experience, the more you know why. And then you kind of understand, I think for me, you kind of get to this refinement point. It's like, oh, I really like this MX Black's alu no foam sound. But then you've reached the end. It kind of gets a little boring. At least for me, it's like, well, that is a sound that I really like. What else is there that I can like? So it's interesting after getting to that point where it's like I built a bunch of boards with MX Blacks and that like bright, loud, clacky sound. It's like, well, I kind of want a little foam in there. So like this has a little foam and then this is MX Blacks, right? So they have very different sound signatures, but I like both. And I build a lot of my keyboards differently for the sake of getting a different sound. Because if all of my keyboards sounded the same, what's the point, right? I like a little bit of the variety there. And again, some things I may not like right now, and then I'll just grow to like again later. Like there's a reason why you like certain things. Like if you like tactiles with a certain foamy sound, you might end up coming back to that because you're like, I like that for a reason. It wasn't arbitrary. You know what I mean? There's something very pleasant about that tactility or the sound that's triggering you in a nice way. And it's just like, yeah, I'm not ashamed to say like certain boards that I've built have foam because I just like the sound of that, right? For contrast.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you described me like I'm a Cherry MX Black's alu plate. That's my go-to. But sometimes I want something different. I do feel like kind of in the early days of the foam adoption, when it was a little more kind of hacky, where you had to cut your own foam, source your own foam, it did feel a little jank, if I had to be honest.
For sure.
Which kind of brings us to the next question. So a lot of boards nowadays kind of have nice foam kits, and the Encore comes with a force break.
The pads.
Yeah, the pads that are like neatly packaged and well presented. And it seems to be that the perception when it is nicely presented and packaged like that and included with the keyboard, people tend to be more okay with that. But the moment you have to cut your own foam or do your own tape mod, some people might say, oh, that's the result of bad keyboard design. And I kind of wanted to ask you, a lot of the products you have that phrase, by design, not default. Would you say that's kind of an example of that, where if it's intended to be used this way or built this way by the designer, there's a difference in perception to that kind of topic?
Yeah, I see. So what you're saying is like, if a particular mod is included and designed that way, then it's favored by the community. If you have to mod a higher end keyboard, then it feels like that was a mistake, right? I mean, I've purchased expensive keyboards and had to mod them anyway, right? Because it's just shaping the sound. Part of me feels a little like, yeah, that's a little unfortunate, but at the same time, it's also part of the fun. I think when you're an enthusiast and you know what you like, and you know the levers you can pull, the modifications that you can do to get it to sound exactly the way that you want it, why would you restrict yourself from that? It could have been that the designer themselves, they actually like the configuration and the keyboard that they built. Maybe they like particular sounds, and to them, maybe it's really good. We don't really know. Like, not a lot of designers share so much of their thoughts and process and what they were going for with the board all the time. But for me, it's like I have my preferences, and some of these things included in here, like the foam, for instance, like that's optional. So I don't think that DIY modifications should be frowned upon because that is up to preference, right? Because even like what sounds really good is also preference, right? That those aren't hard and fast rules.
Right.
And I think sometimes we get caught up in some of that and start, getting a little toxic and start shaming people for things that they like. But I think all of it has a time and a place.
That just made me realize, why don't more designers on their product listing specify my favorite configuration with this was this build? Like no one does that. I think that would be great to have that like perspective of, oh, this is the way the designer preferred it the most and intend and design around. Because you can design for like a certain switch or like a certain plate material.
Absolutely.
It would be great to have that kind of reference, like what the intent was with the designer.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. Maybe I'll add that to my
yeah,
my
that would be
landing
great.
page.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea we should adopt.
But again, like for me, sometimes that's a little bit of a moving target, right? It's like
That's true.
Maybe 3 months ago I would have preferred it this way, and then all of a sudden a new switch comes out, and it's like, ooh, actually this combination is really nice. So maybe that might be one reason. But you're right. I think that's a good way to help point people into a direction of your intent.
Right.
It's like, as a designer, here is my intent, and I think this is the best way to build it.
Like especially if you use like a popular switch or like only one brand of switches, you can attract a whole market base that prefers that kind of same preference as you. So
Right.
I think we should start doing that.
I think we should. Yeah. Maybe I'll include that on my landing page.
So one of the, I think, unique characteristics of the keyboard hobby is that if you stay in the hobby for long enough, you kind of inevitably start picking up bits and pieces of manufacturing processes and knowledge that, like, in general, I feel like, not even just keyboards, just in general, manufacturing knowledge is kind of a black box that not many people know about. What are some like gold mines of manufacturing knowledge that you might have picked up during this process that you could share?
Okay, so I think once you start working with a manufacturer or working with people who have done manufacturing, they will illuminate a lot of things for you that that you didn't know. For instance, right? I think the biggest thing you should consider is the CNC machine, right? So it uses a drill bit, different drill bits, and then it cuts out the details on the board. So having not, like I had a general idea of that, but I didn't understand how things terminate in corners. For instance, like inside corners, like if you have a machine and a drill bit, the interior corners always have to be rounded, even just a little bit, because the way the tool works is like it goes inside right there. So it's impossible to get a perfectly sharp corner on the inside. But on the outside, you could do a perfectly sharp corner if you wanted to, because the machine will pass this direction and then will pass this direction. So it can create a perfect sharp edge if you want that. So that was one little thing I was like, oh, I didn't know. So all outside edges can be sharp if I wanted them to, but all inside corners definitely have to have some kind of curve. So that's like one thing to consider. The more I got into it, and again, because I was working with Mode and their team, they're very knowledgeable about certain things. When we're getting into, for instance, like the design of the profile, right? Like this was an area like, how do we design where this piece of wood stops and ends? So we came up with actually many, many different iterations of how these two interact. How does the alu meet the wood? And at one point we were trying to make an intentional strong seam, like a gap where you would have maybe like a chamfer on both edges, just because we were very worried about lining up the wood and the alu. It's like, oh, this is never going to line up perfectly, so we should create an intentional seam. But because of working through with their manufacturers, the internal team, we came up with a process where it's like, okay, what if we machine the wood slightly bigger than the alu? And then we'll mount these two together and we'll hand sand it so that that makes a perfect edge right here. Yeah. And I was like, oh, I would have never thought about bringing in a hand-done process versus thinking that everything has to be accomplished by machines, which I'm sure you could develop some high-end machinery for that. But that was one process in there that I wouldn't have considered. But working with experienced folks, they can offer solutions to problems that you might have. And I think that's really nice. Like if you're working with somebody who's not as experienced, they won't have as many tools to overcome those constraints that you might have. But working with very experienced people, they can look at it as like, let me think about this. And then they might offer 2 or 3 different ways to tackle the problem if you as a designer are very clear about your intent, right? It's like, this is what I want to happen. I'm open to solutions here. So obviously this was Encore Series 1, which we released earlier in the year and it did very well. So that led us to Encore Series 2. And a lot of this was just trying to create the colors that didn't make the cut in the first round, because I had a lot of color explorations when I initially designed this, but we had to bring it down. It's like, let's just make 4. Let's do your 4 most popular ones that you like. And then these were almost like a second wave of things that I wanted to see in the first one, but never made it, but also gave us room to react to what we learned in the first run. So the first run, this white and white oak and copper sold out super fast in 1 minute. And it looks really good. So I wanted to create a more accessible version of that and try it with a different wood. So we used hard maple here. And this is an alu top and an alu bottom. So this is like a silver bottom here. So it's significantly cheaper than a full copper bottom. So I think this is gonna do well. I really like how this one turned out. And this is one of my favorite builds recently. These are BCPs on PP with ISO top mount. And that sounds very good. The other colors that we have, this is the crema, walnut, and copper. Copper is significantly heavier, like almost like 2.5 times, I believe, than the aluminum. And then this is blue-gray, which is interesting because I think blue-gray doesn't get enough love in the normal lineup of mode products, but I think it's just because people haven't seen it in the right kind of expression. So when I saw this color, I was like, man, this is gonna look really good with walnut, with dark keycaps and copper. I think it's one of those colorways that after people see this, they'll probably buy more mode products with the blue-gray because it's such a nice color.
I do feel like blue-gray is hard because everyone has a different blue-gray.
Correct. I think that's most like once you go from one keyboard brand to another, like the colors are so different. Like things may be called the same, but they're very different. But that's part of the fun, I think, when you're building and matching keycaps to it and switches and everything. And this is the last one, which is my favorite one out of the whole Series 2. So this is crema white oak, which this is my favorite wood. And then it has this Dawn bottom, which it's aluminum anodized, but it's such a nice color. It's kind of like a champagne color. And it just has like a slight tint of magenta in there. It looks so good. And so it just definitely has that kind of like warm and cozy vibes when you're looking at this. And it was meant to pair with my Modern Materials keycaps. So this is the stone base kit. And yeah, I really like how this one turned out.
So you named this the Encore, and in that notebook shot of you brainstorming name ideas, I think one of the portions of the definition you chose is that like people coming back to this keyboard to type on again. If you could only choose one keyboard pillar between acoustics, aesthetics, and typing feel, that you hear the most from your customers saying, I come back to the Encore because of this keyboard experience, which one would you prefer to hear the most from your customers?
Probably number one is aesthetics.
Aesthetics.
So aesthetics, acoustics, and then feel, how I would prioritize those things. Mostly because you can't hear every keyboard you see. But when you're scrolling online, you could identify a keyboard, right? And if it's metal rectangle, metal rectangle, metal rectangle, it's hard to identify what it is. But if you see this, it's like, oh, this has an interesting split wood top, and it's the only one of its kind, then I've created an identifiable kind of like icon representation for this thing, right? So you, from a mile away, you should be able to look in a sea of rectangles like that that's the Encore, right? So that was definitely number one. And I mean, it was one of those challenges too, where there's already a lot of beautiful keyboards out there. So if I'm going to design something, I want to design something that doesn't exist yet, but something that I want to see in the world. And that was definitely one of the big drivers for even taking this project on to begin with.
So I imagine that also plays into a little bit of you also being a designer yourself. So when you purchase other people's keyboards, is aesthetics also your number one thing that you kind of prioritize?
I would say when I'm buying keyboards nowadays, usually I assume that the acoustics is going to be good.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, luckily we have folks like you and Alex and other content creators who do these reviews, and I'm on the streams all the time, and I just like to listen. And most of the time, I would say probably 80% of the time, the boards these days sound good. There's still a few that creep out there that are just like, oh, why did you make it that way? But again, it's preference. We don't know what the designer's intent was, right? But I know what sounds I like, and usually I kind of know some of the factors that lead into that. So nowadays, when I buy boards, sometimes it's just to support a friend, like another designer out there, and I want to collect their art, like how I see it, like I want to collect their work. And then other times, a particular keyboard will just have such a nice feature in it or a nice color, I will just buy it just for that. So for instance, like one keyboard I've been hunting for and finally got is the JJW Derivative.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a nice one.
Yeah, and I got the clay color because I love that brown. I love the design aesthetics of it. It sounds good. I used it at some meetups. And then I love the contrast of just that kind of silver on the back against the color ano. So I felt like that was so tasteful. And it was one of those reasons. So now I have it in my collection, and it's like a beautiful board and something that I can see and examine. So when I'm designing my next thing, you know, I have these objects to study. I have these objects to muse over and be like, oh, I like this feature and I like this feature. And I'm constantly collecting ideas, not only from keyboards, but from just products in general. So a lot of the things that I was looking at when I was designing this and other things is car design. I feel like car design is probably like the best, like the upper echelon of this has to be very good. And a lot of decisions were made to be able to make a beautiful car. And I'm not a car guy either. I just look at it for a lot of the formal aesthetics. It's like, how do the lines move from one end of the car to the next? And how big is the wheelbase? And like, how do all of the shapes relate to each other? And I get to study those things. So when I buy keyboards, I look at it from that lens too.
Well, my final question is, clearly the Encore has received an Encore as a back for a Series 2.
Yeah.
As the designer of this, would you have been a little sad if the Encore didn't receive an Encore?
No.
Okay.
No, because with a lot of things that I do, I look at a project as two things. First, it's just a way for me to express my creativity in a format, right? Whether that's a video online or that's a product that I get to make. So I already got what I wanted out of this, which is here's an expression. I could share it with other people, and monetarily there's some gain there, which is great. So it kind of checks a lot of boxes for me. And the thing that I get the most out of it is I get to learn. So when I take on this project, it's like, cool, I learned CAD modeling and some level of manufacturing from this process, and that's going to stay with me forever. And I love learning. So a lot of these projects that I tend to take on are in the interest of that. Like I get to learn something because that's invaluable for me. Because in the future, 10 years from now, I will have all these projects that I've done that I've learned so many lessons from, and I get to connect the dots in really interesting ways, right? And even this project is a representation of that. Like my kind of dive into enthusiast level keyboards, my love for amateur woodworking, and then me being a designer, a visual designer, like how do all of these things come together? And that's what this current expression is in this keyboard. So yeah, even if it didn't get an Encore, I would be perfectly happy with walking away from this.
Wow, okay. That's not the answer I expected, but that's awesome to hear.
Our lighting changed a little bit.
Oh.
We got a cloud that moved through here, and that's okay.
Perfectly as the last question was answered.
This one is setting.
All right, well, that was it. Just a short little chat with Matthew and Encina. The Encore Series 2 should already be live on modedesigns.com/Taeha types if you want to help support the channel with my affiliate link. There will be a second drop of the Encore Series 2 on December 11th.
Correct.
Yeah, back on Mode's website again. Are there any other upcoming projects or happenings that you want to share before we close this video?
Yeah, I mean, earlier in the year, I worked on the X-ray collection. So the X-ray keycaps, cables, some collaboration keyboards. We did a pre-sale of that earlier in the year, and it should be fulfilling before the end of the year. So if you were interested in that project at all, look out for extras on the vendors' websites.
Okay. Awesome. Well, that's it for this video. Till next time, see you, nerds. Sweet. Oh, perfect timing.
Yeah, like, I was like, it's overcast.
Yeah.
And there's just like a cloud passing. So I was like, oh, of course it's going to happen. Sweet.
All right. Thank you.
Fantastic. Are you sure you hit record?